for joining me for another episode of Cultivate. We are happy that you have joined us for today's conversation, and I have a friend joining me today. I have Andrea with me. A lot of you know Andrea. She is part of our church. Her husband is Pastor John, and they are just incredible, wonderful people, and I am so happy and excited that you said yes and that you're here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
So today we wanted to talk a little bit about anxiety. And I know that that's something that you have dealt with. I don't know if you still kind of deal with it a little bit.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, especially nowadays, deal with anxiety.
Right.
I think a lot of it might be just something that we have and we developed. Sometimes I think it's something that we run into because of the world we live in today.
For sure.
You know, all the different things, you know, happening in the world, and it can make us anxious. But walk me a little bit through that journey for you. Maybe there's a moment you remember feeling that way and you didn't even know it was anxiety.
Yeah. So growing up, thank God, I feel like I had a normal childhood in the sense where I didn't move often. Like I remember moving once, not even I was a baby when I moved. By the grace of God, my parents have always been together, still are together. I grew up with my sister, grew up in church. But I do remember feeling sensations of anxiety I didn't know at the time was anxiety. Like, for example, when we would come back home from a family vacation on a Sunday night and knowing I had to go to school the next day, I would tell my mom, like, Mommy, I feel like crying. And she's like, why? Like, we just got back from vacation. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like crying. She's like, okay, then cry. And then, like, the feeling would kind of go away. And I also remember, like, deadlines, projects, any presentation that I would have to do for school would cause feelings of anxiety, where to a point is normal. I feel like a lot of people struggle with stage fright or just fear of public speaking. But I remember feeling feelings of like, oh, like I wish Jesus could come and like I didn't have to like present that project. And then it wasn't until I believe it was my sophomore year where I took AP psychology in high school. And then we talked about the brain, the mind a lot. And then when we started talking about disorders, my teacher said, okay, like you're all going to want to self-diagnose with something that we're going to talk about. It's completely normal. Like we all have a little bit of something, but please don't go and diagnosing yourself with like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So when we talked about anxiety, he listed all the symptoms and I like met every box. I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel that. Oh my God, I have that. Oh my gosh. And it was like a moment of realization, like, do I have this? And I think 10 years ago, it's not as an open topic as it is now. Back then it was very, I think, still taboo, and it was very weird to talk about. So I remember going home and telling my mom, like, Mom, I think I have anxiety. And she's like, well, why do you say that? And then I just told her what I had learned. I told her things that I had been feeling. Like I was very anxious in school when it came to projects, homework, excelling. Like I was a really good student, but I would feel that pressure to always get A's and B's. And I did. And it wasn't pressure that my parents put on me. It was more from myself. It was very internal pressure that caused anxiety. So I remember my mom, she would pray for me. She would, help me relax. She's like, okay, maybe, drink orange juice and take a break. She's like, maybe your blood pressure is low, and like kind of not knowing what to do. But my aunt she's a school psychologist. So she went to school for psychology, and my mom was kind of asking her like, hey, like Andrea's telling me this. How do I navigate through that? And my aunt kind of led her to finding me a Christian therapist. So I remember going to therapy for the first time and feeling scared but excited. I wanted to get help. I wanted to feel better. I didn't want to deal with panic attacks that I didn't know at the time were panic attacks. And I started my journey of therapy very young, I guess in high school. And that's what kind of helped me navigate through anxiety and what it was, the reasons for it. So I did that in high school. I feel like I was doing okay, made progress. And then I think I went for a year and then stopped. And then they actually called me back to go into like towards the end of my senior year, because one of my triggers was like major life transitions or just transitions. I don't deal with change very well. So they were like, hey, you're a senior in high school about to go into college. We think it would be good for you to come back. And at first I was hesitant. I was like, well, I got this under control. Like, I already know what to do. Take deep breaths, blah, blah, blah. Pray every now and then. Because, you know, anxiety is it's very physical. It's very mental, but it could also be spiritual. And I learned that it could take moments of prayer. It could take moments of reading my Bible. You know, my mom would read all the verses to me. I memorized them. She would tell me, like, be anxious about nothing. Think about the birds. Are you not more important than the birds? He cares about you. Like, all those things. You know, Jesus saying, my burden is light. Like, we don't have to worry. But it's also very practical. So I learned practical tools in therapy. What were some of those
things that they taught you going through therapy?
Yeah. So something that I would do is I would just get stuck and I wouldn't see past the situation and I wouldn't think of best possible scenarios. I would just always think the worst. Like if my mom was late to picking me up at school, I would think, oh my God, she got into a car crash. She died. Like, that's it. Like, I'm not going to have a mom anymore. So they were like, okay, no, maybe not that. Maybe think of other positive, scenarios. Like maybe she's stuck in traffic. Maybe she forgot her keys and had to go back home and get them. And everything's going to be okay. So they taught me how to step by step, not catastrophize. Also journaling helped a little bit. It's not something I'm very into, but I know it helped. Taking deep breaths, it's very physical as well. So they taught me how to do exercises like going outside, going on a scavenger hunt, like finding 5 things you can touch, 4 things you can see, like physical things that would help me kind of cope with in the moment panic attack. But then they also taught me like life, you know, because they were very honest in the sense where like therapy is not going to make it go away, but we're also not saying that you're going to deal with this forever. And I am proud to say I'm not where I was, you know, when I was 16 to where I'm at now. But yeah, does it still linger here and there? Yeah. Do I still have my triggers that trigger moments of anxiety? Yeah. But knowing those practical things, taking deep breaths, thinking, like the power of changing your thinking has helped me a lot. But also staying in church. I never once doubted God. Praying. There are things that I'm like, this will only take prayer. Like, you know, lives of transition, like moments of transition, like getting married, moving apartments. Like that was a very big deal to me. We recently moved in May and I'm like, I'm not ready for this. I was so attached to our apartment. But just practical things, pairing practical things with spiritual things.
I love that.
So that helped.
I love that because nowadays we can either go both ways where it becomes, and I have these conversations with Alex all the time because he used to be all spiritual and not like real practicality.
Yeah.
So some people just go completely spiritual, which yes, it is spiritual, many, you know, in many ways, but it is also very much a practical thing, like retraining our brain and even like what the Bible says is like holding thoughts captive, and you know, bringing them to the reality of God and to the truth of God. And so I love that you say that because sometimes as Christians we think, you know, yes, prayer, absolutely prayer, but also there's practical ways that we can learn to help us as well, and it requires. But did you ever feel paralyzed by anxiety? Like you could maybe a moment where you just felt like you couldn't do this because this feeling didn't let you move?
For sure. There was a time where the best way I could describe it was I literally woke up feeling anxious, went about my day feeling anxious, and like the only time I didn't feel anxious was like at night when I would go to sleep. And I would describe it as like an elephant like sitting on my chest, and it was just this heaviness. And I would think like, but I'm okay. Like I'm okay. Like there's nothing wrong. There's no reason in my head to feel this way. And I would. So I feel like it did stop me from doing a lot of things. And then it did affect like my confidence to a certain extent where, oh, I'm not good enough for this. Like, I'm so anxious. Like, how could I ever do this and that? So I remember a lot of the conversations that I had with my mom. You know, growing up in church, I would go to conferences and I would hear all these pastors and hear their beautiful testimonies on, like, I came from a broken home and now look at me, like, here I am. And I would think, like, okay, cool. I don't have, like, I went through life thinking I didn't have an interesting testimony. So in moments of, like, discovering what anxiety was and how it was affecting my life, my mom would remind me of that. She goes, maybe this is going to be your testimony. Here you are thinking you have nothing to talk about, nothing to share about. And here you are, like, you're going through this today to impact others in the future. And that shifted my perspective, and it's affected me in everything that I've done from then on. Like, for example, being a youth leader, being a connect group leader, being a teacher to kindergarteners, even though they're little, they feel feelings of being scared. So it's given me a lot of tools to help others. But back then, I didn't realize that. You know, even saying yes to being a youth leader, I was like, well, what am I going to do? Like, you know, and it was like God equipped. I always say that word wrong. I added T and John makes fun of me. I'm Esau. So he equipped me in a sense where he gave me that journey to go through to be able to help others. But yeah, for sure, it came with feeling stuck, feeling like I'm always going to feel like this. And a realization that I had, and I don't know if I read it somewhere, if it was spoken to me, but like words that I live by are like, there's more to life than what you're feeling now. And I would just have to remind myself that there's more to life than this. You're not always going to feel like this.
Yeah, that way.
And I think that got me through a lot. That got me through college. That got me through hard seasons in life where I was like, well, if God got me through high school, not knowing what anxiety was, navigating through dealing with it, I can get through this. He can get me through this. I would take it like semester by semester in college, like, okay, if God got me through last semester,
I can do
even
this.
though this one's harder, like, I'm gonna get through it. Like, it's always gonna get done.
I remember, and I told you when I texted you about this, that I remember Alex and I were youth pastors, and we were at a youth camp, and we were getting ready to go inside the auditorium, and it's wild, and everybody rushes in, and you're sitting outside, and you're having a moment. And I remember talking to you, and you're like, no, I'm overwhelmed. And you were physically just like, you couldn't walk in, and you needed that space. Walk me through that moment in your mind. Was it the anxiety of maybe too many people? Was it the anxiety of like what was it that in that moment kind of paralyzed you from doing whatever?
So the thing about anxiety is that sometimes it blocks you and it makes you feel stuck. So thinking back to that moment specifically, it was just a lot. It was a lot of people feeling the pressure to be high energy when naturally I'm not a very high energy person. Like, I always think it's funny when Pastor Alex says like, oh, like, let's get loud. Like, if you can get loud for the Miami Heat. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm just not a loud person. So I'll just like, I love Jesus. So that was a lot. Feeling the pressure of being a connect group leader, being there for my girls.
I mean, youth camp is everything a lot as it is.
Youth camp is ministry. Chaotic. I loved it, but it was just more like that moment specifically was a lot. So then I started to feel my heart pounding. I felt like I couldn't breathe, and I thought, oh my God, it's dark, loud in there. Like, we're gonna be squished. So a lot of that was like physical triggers that in the moment I wasn't at the point where I'm at now, where I can mentally prepare, like, okay, it's going to be dark. It's going to be loud. There's going to be a lot of people. It's going to be crowded, but you're going to be okay. It's okay. So I feel like in that moment, I didn't have the necessary tools that I do have now, even though I was going through therapy, but it felt like a lot. And it felt like the best thing to do in that moment was just to avoid it, which is something that I would do a lot, that I learned is not the way to do it, because you can't avoid things in life.
Yeah.
Like, for example, something that was very hard for me, and this is going to be embarrassing a little, but I had this major fear of driving. And it wasn't even like driving. Like, I trusted myself in knowing I'm going to be a safe driver, but I don't know about
The
crazy
person
Miami
yeah.
people. So I didn't drive for the longest time ever. And it was just this thing that I avoided for a very long time. And it wasn't until John proposed to me and I had the realization, like, I can't be a wife and not drive. What the heck? Like, I'm not going to be completely, fully dependent on my
Right.
husband in this aspect of life. Yes, in other things, I am a submissive wife and I believe in the roles of a woman in marriage. But it was just that I avoided it for so long because of fear. So I think that was one of the biggest things that I overcame, amongst other things. But yeah, there was a lot of things that I would just avoid to not feel anxious.
So just to, I'm thinking a lot of it is, it could be your personality.
Yeah.
Because again, you're not this,
Yeah.
crazy, just loud person who,
Yeah.
is great in or enjoys
Yeah.
these huge
Yeah.
gatherings, groups, whatever.
Yeah.
So we talked about, we were in a staff retreat and you went down a slide and you hurt yourself.
I did.
And you weren't going to do it.
Yeah.
But all the girls were like, do it.
Yeah.
And you did it. And I remember we had a conversation that you mentioned how you grew up very, sheltered is not the word, cautious.
Cautious, correct.
You had a very cautious mom who raised you that way.
Yeah.
So not necessarily bad. Your mom meant the best,
yeah.
of course, in
Yeah.
trying to protect you. But
Yeah.
also maybe in doing so, it created these fears
Right.
of, just doing wild things, or
Yeah.
not even wild things, taking risks and stuff like that. So
correct.
some of it could be your personality and you're prone to that, but also maybe added to that was the fact that you grew up in a very cautious
Yeah.
household.
Yes.
And you were talking to me about it.
Yeah.
And how maybe that could have also played a part.
For sure. So naturally, again, personality, I'm not a risk taker. I would say that being married to John, like, he's brought out the adventurous side in me because I prefer being on the safe side of life.
Yeah.
I didn't play sports growing up because I don't like being outside, first of all. And I don't like risk getting hurt. I never wanted to get hurt. Like, that's not fun. For me, I mean, other people, whatever. But yeah, so it's just the way I think I was raised and just personality wise.
Yeah.
So growing up in a home where I heard be careful a lot or think about the consequences or just always being mindful. I would say I'm a very hyper aware person of myself, my surroundings, my thoughts, to the point where, like, when I started therapy, again, as an adult, I would tell my therapist, like, yeah, what was the word that I would say? I even forgot it because he made me remove it from
Yeah.
my vocabulary. But I would just say, like, oh, I'm blocking out the word. Wow, it really worked. Therapy works. But he would say, no, you're not that. You're just cautious. You're a very cautious person. And he goes, and it's good to be cautious. Certain things in life
Yeah.
require caution, but I'm just overly cautious about certain things. And a lot of it is the way that I was raised. I was speaking to my mom, and my mom is one of my best friends. At this
She's
point in my
awesome.
life, I love her. And I have her permission to talk about her, so I'm going to talk about her. But, as an adult, my mom looked at me one day and she's like, I ruined you. I'm so sorry. Like, all of your fears are essentially my fears that I passed down to you. And, like, it goes from silly fears to flying. Like, I get super nervous on planes. My mom hates flying. Lizards, I hate lizards, but it was because, like, my mom has a phobia of lizards. And then it goes to deeper things where, like, we have intrusive thoughts on certain things. Like, for example, my mom was sharing today that she went to Marshall's and she parked in a parking garage and it was raining. And she's like, oh my gosh, like, what if the rain just, like, makes this parking garage collapse? And I have thoughts like that. And she never vocalized those thoughts, but I guess it's just, I don't want to say genetic, but it's passed down.
Yeah. And I see that a lot now that I have a daughter.
Yeah.
Because again, without her meaning to, and I love because parents could be listening to his moms, and it makes us think about how and what we do when we're around our kids and how it affects them, even our reactions. And I'm so thoughtful about that. My mom and I, it's funny, my mom is overly cautious.
Yeah.
She is definitely not a risk taker. She doesn't want Arya to, I don't know, hurt herself. And of course, I don't want her to hurt herself. But she thinks about it twice before she sees Arya take what she thinks is a big risk. And I am the opposite. So if she kind of stumbles and falls, she's like, oh my God, don't do that. Be careful. And I have made it, it's not that I don't care, but I've made it a point to not always tell her, be careful. Because in my mind, I don't want her to feel afraid, and I don't want her not to explore. So I try to be like, hey, sit down, you can fall. Hey, and try to word things differently. Or not say, don't do that. Because I also, in my mind, I don't want to be that mom, or I don't want her to feel like she can't do risky things. It's like, yes, you can actually get up on that chair. You just have to be mindful of what can happen.
Surroundings.
Make sure. And so I try to be that. And my mom does not understand how I'm so calm and I don't care. And she thinks I'm crazy. And sometimes I think she's crazy, because it's like, just let her live. And if she scrapes her knee, she's going to be okay. And so it's funny because I see that. And my mom raised me that way. And yet I'm not that way. Like, I'm not overly cautious, and I'm not too scared. But as you mentioned, that I think about that. I think about how I try to not do that with Arya, because I don't want her to. I don't want to create those thought patterns in her.
But yeah, no, I agree, and that's something actually that I spoke to my therapist about. Talking about anxiety. Recently, I got diagnosed with ADD. I don't want to say good diagnosed. I realized I had it, and I thought I felt off. And then one time I asked him, I'm like, do you think I have ADD? And it was like very early on in our sessions. He's like, no, why do you say that? And I mentioned a few things. And he said, no, I think that you being a teacher, you take what's effective at work, you take it home, and you don't need it at work. So he told me that at the beginning, but after a few months, he told me, he's like, I'm going to be very honest with you, and I'm going to be very careful with the way I say it, because I don't want to just throw this term loosely. And he goes, I think you have executive functioning disorder. And to the point where I heard that.
What does that mean?
So that means basically I have a hard time initiating tasks.
Okay.
And I get easily overwhelmed to the point where I just don't want to do things. So like, for example, if I know that I have to do laundry and it's like a huge pile of laundry or like a huge pile of dishes, like I'll just avoid it, because in my head, it's hard to do it. But then I realize once I do it, I'm like, oh, it took me a shorter amount of time than I thought, or it wasn't that bad, or big projects or deadlines. So part of that has to do with ADD. And growing up, now reflecting back, I think it was so evident, but it was just not clear. And I think something that he mentioned is that oftentimes in girls and women, ADD gets misdiagnosed as anxiety, or not even misdiagnosed, because I truly feel I went through anxiety, but it just gets like swept under that rug of anxiety. So it's something that I'm learning to navigate. And I remember hearing those words, and I wasn't sad, I wasn't worried, I felt relieved. I'm like, oh my gosh, like my life makes sense now. Now a lot of things, like, it makes sense. So hearing that, knowing my past with anxiety, like I looked at him and I'm like, I almost said his name. I'm like, do you think that when I have children in the future, like, are they gonna have anxiety and ADD? Like, that's something that I think about, and it's something that I pray against. And he kind of like looked at me and kind of like, hate to break it to you, was like, they might. But he goes, but here's the thing, you're working on yourself, you're doing the work, you're gonna have the tools to help your children. And that was like it was both relieving, and it was both like, now I have this responsibility to raise my children, not to say the opposite of how I was raised, but in a new way. And I think that was empowering, in the sense where like everything that I went through wasn't in vain. Yes, it's helped a lot of people, but now I don't even want to call it a generational curse, because it's just life and what we go through, but I'm going to be able to break this cycle potentially. So hearing that, I felt inspired. I felt like not needing to be scared, because when we think about that, like I look at John and I tell him like, oh, like I hope our kids are as smart as you and like fearless and all of that, and I hope they get all your positive traits. And yeah, I know I have positive traits as well, but like that was an area of my life where I'm like, I never want to pass this down to my children. But now thinking like it's almost inevitable, but it is something that can be empowering as a parent, as a future
and
parent.
I think at the end of the day, God is sovereign, that just because you have it or statistics or whatever show the likelihood of, I think at the end of the day, you may have children that don't have any of this.
And there's a possibility as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
So just to think of that, but also think about the fact that, yes, you now have tools. And I think that's the beauty about learning ourselves and bettering ourselves.
Right.
And even understanding like the struggles we've had as people, as human beings, when we have children, because that's going to help us be better for them.
Right.
And when we understand those little things that those tendencies that we have, those, even me sharing that, I know there's little tendencies that I might have that now, because I'm aware of them.
Right.
And I'm working, on those things. I know, and I try, and I'm mindful to not do those things with Arya, or to, have tools to share with her in, the day of tomorrow. So I think it's important to just self-reflect. I also liked what you mentioned about diagnosing people. I feel like we live in a world that likes to diagnose.
Yeah.
And so we went from not talking about certain topics and subjects that were a little taboo, and people didn't talk about anxiety, and they didn't talk about all these things, to now over speaking, over diagnosing. So now any feeling that remotely resent or a moment of anxiety now becomes you have anxiety.
Correct.
You're an anxious person. And I think we are now living in a generation that is trying to grab that diagnosis and put that on ourselves in trying to explain what we have. And so all of us have experienced moments of anxiety, and that doesn't make us anxious.
Yeah. For example, I totally agree. I think, and it's not even diagnosing, it's a lot of self-diagnosing.
Yes. Because there's so much information.
Correct.
And everyone is an expert. And you go on Instagram, everybody knows, and everybody gives you 5 steps, and so it's easy to just say, I have that.
I have that. Correct. For example, one time, I don't even remember specifically, but I just remember going through a hard time, and this was recent. This was like, I believe, a year ago, where I just had a moment, and I truly feel it was a moment of weakness. It was a moment where I feel the devil probably saw where I was at and put this thought in my head. But I just thought, like, what if I just die? And I didn't even think like I'm going to kill myself. It was more like, what if I die? And it was just at that, and I was like, that was a weird thought. I didn't like it. Immediately prayed, went to bed, spoke about it in my next therapy session. And then I started to think like, oh my gosh, am I suicidal? And I'm like, no, wait, I'm not, because I don't have a plan. I'm not going to take action. Like, I love my life. I love my husband. I love my family.
You think about.
It wasn't even something I often thought about. But I feel like a lot of people could take a thought like that and automatically label themselves, oh my gosh, I'm depressed. Oh my gosh, I'm suicidal. So I spoke about it with my therapist, and he's like, no, I don't. He goes, I don't think that's a concerning thought. And I love him, because he even turned it around and he took it to a biblical standpoint, and he's like, you are dead. We're all dead to ourselves, because when we live in Christ, we die to ourselves and we live in him. So it was just a moment of weakness, frustration. Like, I was overwhelmed probably that day, but it doesn't mean I'm suicidal. I'm depressed.
I want to die.
Like, it is possible to go through depressing seasons in your life and depressing events and moments, but it doesn't make you
It doesn't mean that you suffer from depression.
Yeah, you could feel nervous from here and then, but does it mean you're an anxious person? And something that helped me a lot was the way I would say things. I would call anxiety like my anxiety. Like, my anxiety is triggered right now, or I'm just an anxious person. And it was like, I don't remember who spoke it over me, but I believe it was like a leader at youth camp or something that was like, don't call it your anxiety. It's not yours. It's not yours. And when you call it your anxiety, you're giving it power over your mind.
Mm-hmm.
But God has given us power, and he's given us authority to speak life over ourselves.
Yeah.
So removing your verbiage and just realizing that, yeah, maybe you have a hard time focusing.
Yeah. I'm just anxious. I'm having a moment of anxiety. I'm having,
Yeah. So just because, you know, you get a little nervous sometimes doesn't mean you're an anxious person or you have anxiety, or just because you have a hard time focusing, doesn't mean you have ADD. Like, there's a lot of process. Like, there's a lot that goes in the process of being truly diagnosed by a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because at some point, all of us would have had all those feelings.
Right.
You know, of being sad, being anxious, being overwhelmed, being fearful, being all these different things. It's just natural emotions God has given us to cope with things, and they're normal.
Yeah.
Talking about you not being super loud or, you know, and you're fun and you're super sweet. You're just not that. You know, and it's totally fine. I don't think I am that person, even though people might think I am. I am absolutely not. You marry John, who is just so talkative. He can talk to a wall. He's so out. We went to Epcot and we were in the line for a ride, and this guy walks by. So it's a big group of us. We let these people go by so that we can go on the ride together. And the guy was wearing, I think it was a Texas jersey, something that's a Texas, something like that. The guy goes by, and John goes, hey, go ahead, whatever, you can go in front of us. Hey, you're from Texas? And immediately he starts talking to this guy.
That's very John.
And the guy's like, yeah. Oh, what part? The guy tells him what part from Texas. And then immediately he starts asking him questions. And I'm just looking at him. And I am wishing I had that gift. I'm like,
this is my life.
I'm like, I wish
I see this and I live this.
Yeah, I'm thinking like, how? Like, so he talks to him, and I go, John, how do you do that? Like, how do you find something to ask? Like, I'll tell you, hi, how are you, whatever, and then I don't know what to say next.
Right. Same.
And he starts laughing. He goes, my wife is just like that.
Literally.
And he's like, oh, I just find something. And he starts telling me, and it's such a gift that he has.
It's a skill. Like, it's an art. Like, John often says, like, oh, I'm not creative. And I'm like, I think you're so creative in the way you communicate. Like, that's a God-given gift that, like you say, like, I really don't have.
I don't have it.
So
marrying someone like him, and not just marrying someone like him, going into ministry,
right,
where like people is like everything we do. You know, we're surrounded by people. We serve people. How was that for you? That transition, you know, in light of how you feel and like how you are sometimes.
Right. Yeah. So that is very John to the core. And it's just so funny how God brings two completely different people. Like, we're married, and it just like he makes it work. Because I often think about, like, what if I married someone as equally shy as me?
Yeah.
Or as anxious as me? Or, you know, just like, it would be detrimental. Like, it wouldn't be the quality of life to live. So John, like I mentioned, like, brings out my adventurous side that is not like crazy. But, you know, he helps me in that sense. So marrying him, obviously dating him, like especially at church, because we were both serving. We met at church serving in youth ministry. And again, I had a way that I served, and he had the way that he served. We were both connect group leaders. We both had different groups, and we didn't really have to do things together until we got married. Mm-hmm. So looking at his life, and it's so funny, I always joke, like, he's so normal. And then, like, I wish I could be like him. Like, John and I could be sitting next to each other in silence. I'm probably catastrophizing, thinking about my to-do list. How am I going to get everything done? And he's like thinking, what's for dinner? And I'm like, what the heck? And again, just how you were saying, he has the art of communication. And we could be standing, like, it happens every time when we go out to dinner, when we're in a line somewhere, like, he'll just find ways to converse with people, and he'll go out of his way to do it. And I will go out of my way to not. So it's just,
you're just
very
standing there like
interesting. Yeah. Like, oh, Miss Life, like, nice to meet you. And another thing is, like, everywhere we go, he knows a million people. Like, it doesn't fail. Every time we go out, he's like, oh my gosh, do you see that guy? Like, I went to high school with him, and he'll go and say hi to him. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, that girl went to my school. Let's go this way. Yeah, I'm not going to go say hi. She probably doesn't even remember me. And then it's just like, it brought like we're two different people being married, doing ministry together. And I think it's not a balance, but like finding and navigating the rhythms of ministry, and what does being shy, like being a shy person, being a more reserved person, being a private person. I'm very private. I'm very careful with who I share things with. My circle of friends is small. Like I just find comfort in that, but knowing that in ministry you can't be an exclusive person. And you have to a certain extent be vulnerable as connect group leaders. Like we have to be vulnerable and we have to share. And then I think it was just learning from him, but then him also learning from me. And like we don't always have to talk. Like for example, in connect group, he would it's so funny. I was like, oh my gosh, like feeling anxious for people who are like me, because I know in a group of people, you have your people who are extroverted, you have your people who are introverted. You know,
it's like, that's me.
Yeah. So he would ask a question, and if no one would answer in 0.2 seconds, he would answer his own question. And I would tell him, babe, like you need to give thinking time. In teaching, there's this concept called thinking time. You ask a question and you give 10 seconds for the children to answer. And he's like, but that's so awkward, sitting in 10 seconds of silence. I'm like, right, but people need to process your question. People need to think about what they're going to say. So he's like, okay, I'm going to put it into practice next time. And now it's something that he knows and he's aware of. So it's like I learn things from him. He learns things from me. And I just think it's so beautiful that God would bring two different people to be married, to do ministry together, and to just learn from one another. I think that's one of the biggest things that marriage has taught me, like just learning from one another, understanding that, yes, John and I are very different people, but there's beauty in that. And there's ways that we can learn from one another and help one another come out of our shells, or actually like take a step back. Come back to let's be in our shell together. So it's been a balance of learning what is okay for ministry, what's not okay for ministry. I know that I'm gonna have to talk to people when I don't feel like talking to people. I'm gonna have to share things about myself that I don't really want to share about, because it could help someone else. Like I'm super open about, again, anxiety. That's why we're here, because I know that that's something that can help people. I've learned to get over stage fright. Like when I was asked to do offering and announcements, I'm like, oh my God, like no. I wanted to say no. And then having a super encouraging husband, like, hey, you're called for this. Like, you can do this. Like, they wouldn't ask you if they didn't believe in you. God wouldn't ask you if he didn't know that you could do it. So it's been a lot of learning from one another and meeting somewhere in the middle at times.
Yeah. And that it doesn't mean that because you don't have the qualities that he has, that you're not as good as he is.
Right.
It's just you're a different person. And I hear you say those things and I feel like that's Alex and I. I've never personally dealt with anxiety. I am on the shy side.
Right.
Maybe not so shy, maybe.
I would say you're reserved.
I'm more reserved and I consider myself to be very awkward. Like I'm a really awkward person.
I feel that too.
Like if I meet you again, I say hi, how are you? And then I'm not good at small talk.
Neither
and
am
I was
I.
talking to John and he's like, Andrea does not like small talk. She can't, but she would sit down with you and I'm like, that's me.
Yeah.
The small talk, I just, it's not that I don't want to. I don't even know how to. I get like, I don't know.
Like, what do you talk about? Like,
but if you want to sit down and talk to me about something, I will have the longest conversation with you. I will. And so, but Alex can just talk to anyone.
Right.
And that's just how he is. So it's the same thing. He'll ask something else. He'll say, and I'm just like, and it's not that, because when I hear you speak, it's not that you don't want to be with people or that you don't love people. Is that you do it differently.
Right.
Is that you love and you show affection in a different way. Your skills are different and they're so valuable too. And you've even taught him how to maybe sometimes, the whole thing about connect group and 10 seconds, I've done the same exact thing. I'm like, Alex cannot be in silence. Like if he met someone and it's silent to him, it's so awkward. And I'm like, silence does not mean awkward. Like silence, it's okay. Yeah. Like we don't always have to talk.
Right.
There doesn't always have to be a conversation. We can be together and there be a moment of silence. So again, I hear that and I love that you're a different person and there's a place for you and there's people that feel that way and that understand you, and then you still support him, he still supports you. And so it's also embracing, you know,
Your
who we are.
difference, yeah.
But also developing
certain skills,
certain things, because
right.
it's easy to say, well, I'm not this person,
Yeah.
so I'm never going to do it.
Right.
But you have done a great job at, I'm not this person, but I do know that I can grow and get better. I do know that I
Correct.
can develop certain skills because this is what I do, because
Yeah.
people is what I'm surrounded. And, you know, like
Of
I'm
course.
in ministry, so I might not be this bubbly person,
Yeah.
but I am going to push myself to go out there and say something and do this and whatever. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. And I love that you said, like, it doesn't disqualify you in any way. It doesn't make me like, yeah, we're both different, but doesn't mean that I can't serve in ministry with
Right.
him. And I think at the beginning of our marriage, it was a little challenging, and it was something that I soon realized. I'm like, I need to get over this, because I would compare myself to him and wonder, like, oh my gosh, like, I have to match his level. Like, his capacity is huge. Like, he can do a million things in one day. He can book his schedule. He can do like 3 things in one day. He can talk with people and like never get tired of it. And I'm like, my capacity is not that big. I need like 1 event a day. And if I have 2 events in a day, I need a nap in between to recharge my social batteries. So I would look at the way that he lived. I would look at the way that he served. I would look at the way that he would just be around people. And I thought, okay, now that I'm his wife, now that we're in ministry together, I have to match that. And very soon I realized, absolutely not. I don't. Mm-hmm. We're both different people. We both function differently. But that doesn't mean that I'm not meant to be doing this with him. Right. And that doesn't mean that I have to change who I am. I remember very vividly, God told me one time, like, you don't have to change who you are. You don't have to compare, and you don't have to compete, because easily in ministry, like, it could become like competitive, like, oh, like this person's doing this, so I have to do this. They're doing mm-hmm. that, and I have to do this. So those 3 words have stuck with me for life. You don't have to change, you don't have to compare, and you don't have to compete to live the calling that I have for you. And again, being married, like, it opened my eyes. So yeah, sometimes we do things differently. Sometimes we cope differently. What's relaxing to him is not relaxing to me. Our mornings look a little different. I like to be in silence. I love silence.
Same.
Especially as a teacher. I'm sure you as a mom, like, I'm overstimulated at work. I drive home in silence. Like, I enjoy silent car drives. I enjoy calling people. Like, I'll call my mom, my dad, my grandma on my way home. But other than that, like, being at home, like, silence. And John needs to be blasting music, listening to a podcast.
That's Alex
doing
too.
A million things. And I'm just like, I can't. There was one night, it was a Sunday night, and it was a long Sunday. And John was talking to me. I think there was music playing, and I just went like, shh, can we just shh for a little bit? And he's like, why? And I'm like, because I need to mentally prepare for my week. I need to just appreciate, live in this silence just for a little bit. And he's like, okay.
I love that.
Cool for you. But yeah, it's just navigating that and just realizing that it's okay to be different, and we don't have to be like everyone else. And it's cool to find people that you relate with. Like, I think back on my years of being a youth leader with my co-lead, who is also one of my best friends in the whole entire world, Amy. She's the complete opposite of me.
Oh, yeah.
She is very extroverted, very loud, like always down to dance, something, like always laughing. And I love that I'm best friends with her, because it brings out mm-hmm. another side of me, and she brings me out of my shell. But I remember being co-leaders together, it was so natural that like the quiet, shy girls you gravitated to me, and then like the more extroverted girls gravitated to her. So like that taught me like it's okay to be different, and there's someone for everyone, and you relate to people in different ways. So I just think that's the beauty of different personalities in ministry.
Yeah, I love that. And all to say, whichever way God made you, embrace it. And again, it's okay to be who you are, but it's also good to get better,
right?
Develop your skills.
Correct.
If there's areas that opportunities of growth, take them,
right?
And make yourself better without losing who you are.
Correct.
I think of all or most of the people in high capacity, you know, roles in church, and I think about you and like Danny and some of like the girls married to pastors. I feel like we've all went through a moment of feeling a little lost, where we were trying to figure out ourselves. Thinking I know that happened to me. Like, I'm not Alex. I'm not this like person, and I can't keep up. And even if I wanted to, it's just exhausting because that's just not who I am. Until it's just finding yourself and realizing that, no, I don't have to be that. There's a reason why I am who I am, and God made me this way, and God placed me here because I bring something to the table just the way that I am, and you end up making great teams. And so thank you so much for sharing and for being vulnerable. Before we finish, what would you say to someone who maybe is watching right now and they're dealing with anxiety? Like, what steps would you give them? What would you say they can do to get started maybe in a healing journey?
For sure. I would say it's definitely both the natural and the supernatural, practical and faith, relying on God, your daily devotional life, prayer, worship. I heard once that it's impossible to feel gratitude and anxiety at the same time. And it's so true. So putting those practices in, like, I'm going to rely on God to strengthen me, rely on God to give me peace, but then also taking practical steps, like going to therapy, journaling, stopping for a minute, taking deep breaths, exercising. Like, anxiety is very mental, but it's also very physical, like going on a walk, taking deep breaths, all of those things. So putting into practice the practical things, but also the faith aspect, the spirituality of it. And I think once you combine those two, like how we were saying before, it can't just be all practical things. We need to rely on God. But people do over spiritualize it sometimes, where it's like, well, are you praying enough? Are you reading your Bible? And it's like, yes, I am, but I still feel anxious. So just combining the two and just understanding that it's a journey, and step by step, there's more to life than you're feeling now. And we can overcome with God.
Yes, love it. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. I hope that this helped you, encouraged you, maybe even challenged you in some ways. And remember, God made you a specific way. Embrace it, love it, get better, and continue to develop who He made you to be. And we love you. We'll see you next time.